Doctor?" Sarah Whitehorse was examining the broken wing of a red-tailed hawk in her remote Rocky Mountain cabin when the February blizzard struck with unprecedented fury. Through the howling wind that rattled her windows like skeletal fingers, she heard something that made her blood freeze desperate. High-pitched cries cutting through the storm like knives through silence. She found them huddled against her porch, 3 bobcat cubs, barely 4 weeks old, their tiny bodies trembling beside their mother's mutilated corpse, bearing wounds so precise and unnatural that no known predator could have made them. 18 months later, after the cubs had grown into magnificent predators under the unlikely protection of Thunder, her battle-scarred German shepherd, Dr. Marcus Ravencrow, arrived at her sanctuary with federal agents in tow, his eyes cold as winter stone as he claimed the cats were government property, a revelation that would shatter everything Sarah believed about her peaceful refuge and force her to confront the horrifying truth that had cost her everything she'd ever loved, including her son's life. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The cabin sat like a fortress of solitude 20 miles from the nearest town, perched on a windswept ridge in the Colorado Rockies where the pine trees grew thick and the silence stretched for miles. Sarah Whitehorse had chosen this isolation deliberately 3 years ago, after the world had taken everything from her, her veterinary practice, her reputation, and, most devastatingly, her 5-year-old son, Tommy. At 45, she carried herself with the careful posture of someone who had learned that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her Lakota heritage had taught her to listen to the land, but these days the mountains whispered only warnings. The former veterinary clinic she'd converted into an unofficial wildlife sanctuary bore the scars of her previous life medical equipment gathering dust, prescription bottles with faded labels, and photographs of Tommy that she couldn't bear to pack away but couldn't stand to look at directly. Thunder emerged from the shadows of the cabin's main room, his massive German shepherd frame moving with the calculated precision of a soldier who'd seen too much combat. At 7 years old, the dog carried his own invisible wounds from Afghanistan, where he'd watched his handler die in an ambush that should never have happened. Sarah's late husband had brought Thunder home from his final deployment, but neither man nor dog had lived long enough to heal together. The relationship between Sarah and Thunder was built on mutual understanding of loss. Neither spoke of their trauma, she couldn't. He wouldn't, but they functioned as a unit forged by grief. Thunder's hypervigilant nature matched Sarah's own paranoia, his tendency to patrol the perimeter at odd hours mirroring her sleepless nights spent watching for threats that might never come, or might already be here. The nearest town of Pine Ridge held a mix of tribal members who respected Sarah's need for solitude, and federal employees whose presence felt increasingly intrusive. Chief Robert Bearcloud, her childhood friend from the reservation, made monthly visits that felt more like wellness checks than social calls. His warnings about unmarked vehicles and increased government activity in the area only confirmed what Sarah already suspected, that Tommy's death hadn't been the accident everyone claimed, and that the same forces responsible for destroying her previous life were still watching, still waiting. In this harsh landscape where winter lasted 8 months and neighbors were measured in miles rather than yards, Sarah had found the kind of isolation that allowed wounds to fester undisturbed, but also the kind of peace that made healing seem possible, if she could ever learn to trust again. The blizzard had been raging for 6 hours when Sarah heard the cries that would change everything. She'd been working by lamplight, her weathered hands gentle as she splinted the hawk's wing. When Thunder's head snapped up from his position by the fire, his ears pricked forward in that particular way that meant danger, but his low whine carried a note she'd never heard before. Not warning, but something closer to distress. The wind was howling like a living thing, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow spiraling in ghostly columns across the clearing. Sarah pulled on her heavy coat and followed Thunder to the door, her heart already racing with the kind of dread that had become her constant companion since Tommy's death. The German shepherd pressed against her leg, his massive body trembling not with cold but with an emotion she couldn't identify. That's when she heard them thin, desperate mewling sounds, barely audible above the storm's fury. Sarah grabbed her emergency medical kit and a heavy-duty flashlight, pushing out into the brutal wind with Thunder close beside her. The snow was knee-deep and still falling, each step a battle against the elements that seemed determined to drive her back inside. She found them huddled against the cabin's foundation, 3 tiny bundles of spotted fur pressed against something that made Sarah's stomach lurch. The mother bobcat lay on her side, her beautiful coat matted with blood that had already begun to freeze in the sub-zero temperatures. But it wasn't the sight of death that made Sarah's hands shake as she knelt in the snow. It was the nature of the wounds. The cuts were too clean, too precise. No bear or mountain lion killed like this. These weren't the ragged tears of natural predation, but surgical incisions, as if someone had methodically dissected the animal while it was still alive. Metallic glints caught her flashlight beam. Small tags pierced through the mother's ears, bearing numbers and symbols that looked disturbingly official. The cubs couldn't have been more than 4 weeks old, their eyes open but unfocused with cold and terror. They were hypothermic, their tiny bodies barely warm to the touch, despite their mother's attempt to shelter them with her final breath. Sarah scooped them up, wrapping them in her coat as Thunder whined anxiously beside her. Back inside the cabin, Sarah worked with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd lost too much already. She set up a makeshift nursery near the fireplace, surrounding the cubs with heated blankets and trying every technique she'd learned in 30 years of veterinary practice. But nothing worked. They refused the bottle, turned away from the syringe, and seemed to withdraw further into themselves with each passing hour. Thunder watched from across the room, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on the failing cubs with an intensity that made Sarah's chest tighten. She'd seen that look before in her own mirror, in the days after Tommy's funeral when the world felt too sharp and bright to bear. It was the look of someone watching life slip away and being powerless to stop it. On the second day, as Sarah sat exhausted beside the cubs who had barely moved since their rescue, Thunder approached slowly. Sarah tensed, ready to intervene if his predatory instincts kicked in. German shepherds weren't known for their patience with small prey animals, and Thunder's military training had emphasized aggression over nurturing. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Thunder lowered himself to the floor beside the cubs, his massive head extended toward them with infinite gentleness. He began to lick the smallest one, a female with a distinctive white patch on her ear, with the same careful attention Sarah's own mother had once given to orphaned foals on the reservation. The cub stirred for the first time in hours, turning its tiny face toward Thunder's warmth. Within minutes, the other 2 had crawled closer, drawn by some instinct that recognized safety even across species lines. Sarah watched in amazement as Thunder curled his body around them, creating a living fortress of protection and warmth. That night, For the first time since their rescue, the cubs began to nurse. Not from Thunder. Nature hadn't equipped him for that impossibility. But they accepted the bottle when he was present, as if his approval gave them permission to trust again. Sarah sat in her chair, tears streaming down her face as she watched the German shepherd who'd lost his handler become a father to 3 orphaned predators who'd lost their mother to something far more sinister than nature's cruelty. But even as hope flickered to life in her chest, Sarah couldn't shake the image of those precise wounds, those official-looking tags. Someone had been tracking the mother bobcat. Someone had killed her with surgical precision. And if they discovered that the cubs had survived, they would come looking. Thunder seemed to sense her thoughts, lifting his head to meet her gaze across the firelit room. In his eyes, she saw the same protective determination that had once made him a warrior. Whatever had killed the cub's mother, whatever threat was lurking in the darkness beyond her sanctuary, Thunder was ready to face it. The question was whether love would be enough to keep them all alive. 2 months had passed since that brutal February night, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The 3 cubs whom Sarah had named Shadow, Storm, and Spirit after their distinctive markings and personalities, had grown from trembling bundles of fur into confident young predators under Thunder's unwavering protection. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save 3 dying animals had evolved into something Sarah had never witnessed in her decades of veterinary practice, a genuine interspecies family. Thunder had appointed himself their drill sergeant, teacher, and guardian all at once. Each morning, Sarah would watch from her kitchen window as the German shepherd led his unusual charges through what could only be described as military-style exercises. He taught them to move in formation, to respond to specific whistle commands, and to patrol the perimeter of the sanctuary with the methodical precision of soldiers on reconnaissance. The cubs, now the size of house cats and growing larger each day, followed his lead with an intelligence that bordered on the uncanny. Shadow, the smallest female with the white ear patch, proved to be the strategist of the group. She would position herself at vantage points during their exercises, watching for threats with an alertness that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of Thunder's own hypervigilance. Storm, the larger male, had inherited what Sarah could only call Thunder's protective instincts, often placing himself between perceived dangers and his family. Spirit, the smaller male, displayed an almost supernatural ability to sense Sarah's moods, appearing at her side whenever grief threatened to overwhelm her. The routine gave structure to Sarah's days in a way she hadn't experienced since Tommy's death. She would wake before dawn to prepare bottles for the cubs, who still supplemented their increasingly solid diet with formula. Thunder would already be alert, having completed his first patrol of the morning. The unusual family would breakfast together on the cabin's front porch, the cubs wrestling playfully while Thunder maintained his watchful stance. But beneath this newfound happiness, darkness was gathering like storm clouds. Sarah had begun noticing things that made her former paranoia seem justified. Unmarked vehicles appeared on distant ridges, too far away to identify but close enough to make Thunder's hackles rise. Her mail delivery had become sporadic, and when packages did arrive, they showed signs of having been opened and resealed. Most disturbing of all, her veterinary supply orders were consistently delayed or canceled without explanation. as if someone was systematically cutting off her access to medical resources. Chief Robert Bear Cloud's monthly visits had increased to weekly check-ins, and the worry lines around his weathered eyes had deepened. During his most recent visit, he'd sat at Sarah's kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee that had grown cold while he shared intelligence that made her blood run cold. "There's been talk in the federal offices in Denver," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper despite the cabin's isolation. "Questions about missing specimens from some kind of research facility. Word is they're offering significant rewards for information about unusual animal activity in the region." Sarah had felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied thoughts of government interference. "What kind of specimens?" "The kind that would explain those wounds on the mother cat you found." Robert's dark eyes had met hers across the table. "Sarah, there are military programs that most people don't know exist. Programs that would make what happened to your Tommy look like a warning shot." The memory of that conversation haunted Sarah as she watched the cubs play in the afternoon sun. They were growing so fast it seemed impossible, their coordination and intelligence developing at a rate that defied everything she knew about normal bobcat maturation. Thunder moved among them like a proud father, occasionally correcting their form during hunting practice or rumbling a low warning when their play became too rough. It was during one of these peaceful afternoons that the phone rang. Sarah rarely received calls. Her isolation was as much about avoiding human contact as it was about protecting animals, so the sound made both her and Thunder freeze. The cubs sensed the tension immediately, ceasing their play to look toward the cabin with ears pricked forward. The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, with just a hint of an accent Sarah couldn't place. "Dr. Whitehorse. This is Dr. Marcus Ravencrow. I'm a wildlife specialist with the Department of Natural Resources, and I understand you've been caring for some orphaned bobcats." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. She hadn't reported the cubs to any official agency, hadn't contacted the Department of Natural Resources, hadn't told anyone outside of Chief Bear Cloud about their existence. "I'm sorry. Who did you say you were?" "Dr. Ravencrow. I specialize in unusual wildlife rehabilitation cases, and I'd very much like to offer my assistance with your current situation. These cases can be quite challenging, and I have resources that might prove invaluable." Through the window, Sarah could see Thunder standing perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the tree line where shadows moved in ways that might have been wind, but felt like something more deliberate. The cubs had disappeared entirely, using stealth skills Thunder had somehow taught them, despite being a domestic dog. "I appreciate the offer," Sarah said carefully, "but we're managing quite well on our own. I'm sure you are. Your reputation as a veterinarian precedes you, even after after the unfortunate circumstances that led to your departure from conventional practice." The pause was calculated, weighted with implication. "But these particular animals may require expertise beyond traditional rehabilitation methods." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. This stranger knew about her lost license, about the pharmaceutical company scandal that had destroyed her career when she'd tried to expose their illegal animal testing. More terrifyingly, he seemed to know exactly what she was dealing with regarding the cubs. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice betrayed her fear. "Dr. Whitehorse, I think we both know these aren't ordinary bobcats. Their mother was part of a research program, and her offspring carry certain characteristics that require specialized care. Without proper understanding of their needs, you may inadvertently cause them harm. Sarah hung up the phone with shaking hands, but it rang again immediately. She let it go to the ancient answering machine. "Doctor," Raven Crow's voice filling the cabin with its deceptively reasonable tone. "I'll be in the area next week. I do hope we can meet in person to discuss this situation, for everyone's safety, including the animals." That evening, as Sarah sat on her porch watching Thunder lead the cubs through their evening patrol, she felt the walls of her sanctuary closing in. The cubs had given her purpose, had begun to heal wounds she'd thought were permanent. Thunder had found peace in his role as their protector, his military trauma channeled into something constructive rather than destructive. But someone out there knew about them. Someone with official credentials and unofficial threats. Someone who spoke of research programs and specialized care in the same tone bureaucrats had used when they'd destroyed her career and, she was increasingly certain, when they'd murdered her son. As if sensing her thoughts, Thunder returned to the porch and pressed his massive head against her leg. The cubs followed, Shadow curling up on her feet while Storm and Spirit flanked her chair like furry sentinels. For a moment, the fear receded, replaced by fierce protectiveness. She'd failed to protect Tommy, failed to save him from whatever shadowy forces had orchestrated his death. But she wouldn't fail again. Not with this family, this impossible family that had chosen each other across every biological boundary. Whatever Dr. Raven Crow represented, whatever program had created and then murdered the mother bobcat, Sarah was ready to fight. She'd lost everything once before. This time, she had Thunder beside her, and 3 young predators who'd already proven that loyalty was stronger than instinct. This time, she wouldn't go down without a battle. Dr. Marcus Ravencrow arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June, driving a pristine white SUV that looked government-issued despite its lack of official markings. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as he parked near the tree line, deliberately staying far enough from the cabin to appear non-threatening while positioning himself to observe the entire compound. Thunder's reaction was immediate and visceral, a low growl that rumbled from deep in his chest as every muscle in his body went rigid with military alertness. The cubs vanished instantly, disappearing into the underbrush with the silent efficiency Thunder had drilled into them over months of training. Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with dread. They were learning to be invisible, which might be the only thing that kept them alive. Ravencrow emerged from his vehicle with the calculated movements of someone accustomed to potentially hostile environments. He was perhaps 55. With graying hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and the kind of weathered face that suggested extensive time outdoors. His clothes were expensive but practical hiking boots that had seen real use, cargo pants with numerous pockets, and a lightweight jacket that could have concealed any number of items. "Dr. Whitehorse?" he called out, raising his hands in a gesture that was meant to appear peaceful, but reminded Sarah uncomfortably of military surrender protocols. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "I don't recall agreeing to anything," Sarah replied, stepping onto her porch with Thunder pressed against her leg. The German shepherd's eyes never left Ravencrow, tracking his every movement with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Ravencrow's smile was professionally warm, but didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit, but I was in the area and thought we might have a productive conversation about your current situation." "What situation would that be?" "The 3 bobcat cubs you've been caring for since February." He reached slowly into his jacket, withdrawing a manila folder thick with documents. "I have photographs, if you'd prefer not to continue the pretense." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ravencrow opened the folder, revealing aerial photographs that made Sarah's blood freeze. The images showed her property from above, clearly depicting Thunder leading the cubs through their morning exercises. The resolution was impossibly sharp, capturing details that suggested surveillance equipment far beyond civilian capabilities. "Remarkable, isn't it?" Ravencrow's voice carried a note of genuine admiration. "The bond they've formed with your dog is unprecedented in my experience. I've been studying interspecies relationships for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this." "Who are you?" Sarah asked, abandoning the pretense that had already been stripped away. "I told you, Dr. Marcus Ravencrow, wildlife specialist, though I suppose my credentials are more extensive than I initially indicated." He stepped closer, ignoring Thunder's increasingly aggressive posture. "I hold doctorates in veterinary medicine and behavioral psychology, with specialized training in exotic animal management. I've consulted for various government agencies on matters of sensitive wildlife management." The euphemisms sent chills down Sarah's spine. Sensitive wildlife management sounded like the kind of bureaucratic language used to disguise atrocities. "What do you want?" "To help. These cubs aren't ordinary bobcats, Dr. Whitehorse. Their mother was part of a research program designed to enhance certain natural abilities: intelligence, physical development, survival instincts. The cubs have inherited those traits, which is why they're developing so rapidly and responding so well to your dog's training." Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "What kind of research program?" "The kind that serves national security interests. The kind that requires strict oversight and specialized care." Ravencrow's tone remained conversational, but steel had crept into his voice. "The cubs were considered lost when their mother escaped from our facility 6 months ago. We've been searching for them ever since." "Their mother didn't escape," Sarah said, her voice harsh with anger. "She was murdered. I found her body. Those wounds weren't from any natural predator." For the first time, Ravencrow's professional mask slipped slightly. "The mother's death was regrettable. She became aggressive during transport, and the containment team was forced to use lethal measures. We assumed the cubs had died with her." "Containment team," Sarah repeated the words like a curse. "You mean the people who cut her apart while she was still alive?" "Dr. Whitehorse, I understand your emotional attachment to these animals. But you must understand the larger picture. These cubs represent years of research and development. They've been bred for specific purposes, and their potential contribution to national security is immeasurable." Thunder's growl had escalated to a barely controlled snarl, and Sarah could feel the tension radiating from his massive frame. Somewhere in the forest, she knew the cubs were watching, learning, preparing for whatever might come next. "What happens if I refuse to hand them over?" Ravencrow's expression hardened. "That would be unfortunate for everyone involved. These animals are classified as federal property under several national security statutes. Harboring them without authorization is a federal crime punishable by significant prison time. Additionally, Without proper care and understanding of their enhanced capabilities, they could become dangerous to you and your community. They're not dangerous, Sarah protested. They're protective, loyal, for now, Ravencrow interrupted. But as they mature, their predatory instincts will intensify beyond normal parameters. They're already larger and stronger than typical bobcats their age. In 6 months, they'll be capable of taking down adult humans with ease. Without proper conditioning and control measures, they'll become killing machines. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, but she forced herself to remain standing. You're lying. I wish I were Dr. Whitehorse. I knew your son. The statement came out of nowhere, delivered with surgical precision to cause maximum damage. Sarah felt her knees buckle, and only Thunder's steadying presence kept her upright. Tommy was a bright boy, curious about the world around him. He started asking questions about some research facilities in the area, questions that attracted the wrong kind of attention. Ravencrow's voice carried what might have been genuine regret. I tried to warn him, tried to convince my superiors that he was just a curious child, not a security threat. You're saying they killed him because he was asking questions? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. I'm saying that sometimes curiosity can be dangerous, especially when it involves classified programs. Tommy's death was meant to look like an accident, a tragic car crash that would discourage further investigation. Ravencrow stepped closer, his eyes boring into Sarah's. But if you continue to harbor these animals, if you force us to take official action against you, your death won't need to look accidental. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Sarah felt something break inside her chest, a final barrier between grief and rage that had been holding her together for 3 years. They'd killed Tommy. They'd murdered her 5-year-old son to protect their secrets. And now, they wanted to take away the only family she had left. Get off my property, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Dr. Whitehorse, get off my property, or I'll let Thunder tear your throat out. The German shepherd stepped forward as if summoned, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth that had been weapons of war. You have 10 seconds. Ravencrow backed toward his vehicle, his professional composure cracking for the first time. You're making a mistake. We'll return with proper authorization, and when we do, your cooperation won't be optional. Then you'd better bring an army, Sarah replied, because we won't go quietly. As Ravencrow's SUV disappeared down the mountain road, Sarah sank onto her porch steps with Thunder pressed against her side. The cubs emerged from the forest one by one, moving with the fluid grace of natural predators, but approaching with the trust of beloved pets. Shadow settled against Sarah's left side, Storm and Spirit flanking Thunder like an honor guard. For the first time since Tommy's death, Sarah felt something other than grief and guilt. She felt purpose. These animals, this impossible family, had chosen her just as surely as she'd chosen them. They'd survived government experiments, military training, and bureaucratic callousness to find their way to her sanctuary. Chief Bear Cloud's truck appeared on the horizon just as the sun began to set, arriving as if summoned by some invisible signal. As he climbed out of his vehicle, Sarah could see the grim determination in his weathered features that meant he'd already heard about Ravencrow's visit. "They're coming back," she told him without preamble. I know. Robert settled beside her on the steps, his presence solid and reassuring. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Sarah looked at Thunder, at the cubs who'd grown from trembling orphans into magnificent young predators, at the mountain sanctuary that had become their fortress. For 3 years, she'd been running from the people who'd destroyed her life. But running time was over. We're going to fight, she said simply. For Tommy. For these cubs. For everyone they've silenced. We're going to make them pay. In the gathering darkness, Thunder's eyes gleamed with the cold fire of a warrior remembering his purpose, while 3 young bobcats pressed closer to the woman who'd chosen to be their mother. The battle lines had been drawn, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The government had made one crucial mistake in their calculations. They'd assumed that broken people would stay broken, that grief would make Sarah weak rather than dangerous. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. 3 days after Ravencrow's visit, they came at dawn. Sarah woke to Thunder's low, urgent growl and the sound of vehicles moving up the mountain road with their engines deliberately muted. Through her bedroom window, she counted at least 6 black SUVs winding their way through the pine trees. Their occupants likely armed and certainly authorized to use whatever force they deemed necessary. The cubs were already invisible, having vanished into the forest the moment Thunder's alert stance had signaled danger. Sarah dressed quickly in dark clothing and hiking boots, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She'd known this moment would come, had spent the past 72 hours preparing for it with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had nothing left to lose. Chief Bear Cloud had helped her establish defensive positions throughout the property, using his knowledge of military tactics and her intimate familiarity with the terrain to create advantages that might level the playing field against superior numbers and firepower. Hidden caches of supplies, emergency communication equipment, and escape routes mapped through the densest parts of the forest, all the tools of people who understood they were fighting for survival rather than victory. The lead vehicle stopped 50 yards from the cabin, its occupants emerging with the coordinated precision of a special operations team. Sarah recognized the type from her husband's military stories, federal agents who specialized in situations too sensitive for local law enforcement, too dangerous for bureaucratic niceties. They wore tactical gear that suggested they expected resistance, carried weapons that indicated they were prepared to overcome it. Dr. Ravencrow stepped out of the second vehicle, no longer bothering with his facade of reasonable concern. He wore body armor beneath his jacket and moved with the confidence of someone backed by unlimited federal authority. Behind him came a woman in an expensive suit who looked like she'd never been closer to wildlife than a zoo exhibit, but whose presence suggested legal authority that could be more dangerous than any weapon. "Dr. Sarah Whitehorse," the woman called out, her voice carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Deputy Director Catherine Mills from the Department of Homeland Security. We have federal warrants for the seizure of illegally harbored government property and your arrest on charges of harboring classified materials." Sarah stepped onto her porch, thunder at her side and fury burning in her chest like molten steel. "Show me the warrants." Mills gestured to one of the agents, who approached with a leather portfolio thick with official documents. Sarah scanned them quickly, her veterinary training having given her enough experience with legal paperwork to recognize both the legitimacy and the deliberate vagueness of the charges. They were phishing, using national security classifications to justify what amounted to theft and kidnapping. "These animals aren't government property," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising steadiness. "They're orphaned wildlife that I've rehabilitated according to established protocols. The animals in question are the offspring of specimens developed under classified research programs." Ravencrow interjected, stepping forward with clinical detachment. "Their genetic modifications make them inherently dangerous to civilian populations and requiring specialized containment." "Genetic modifications," Sarah repeated the words with disgust. "You mean torture? You mean illegal experimentation on wild animals for military purposes?" Mill's expression didn't change, but several of the agents shifted uncomfortably. Even hardened federal operatives apparently had limits to what they could stomach, and animal cruelty clearly pushed against those boundaries. "The nature of the research is classified," Mills said firmly. "What matters is that these animals pose a potential threat to national security if left in unauthorized hands. We're prepared to resolve this situation peacefully. But make no mistake, we will resolve it." That's when Thunder made his move. The German shepherd had been motionless beside Sarah. But as Mills finished speaking, he stepped forward and released a bark that echoed through the mountains like a battle cry. It wasn't the bark of a domestic dog protecting his owner, it was the controlled aggression of a military working dog issuing a challenge to enemy forces. The response was immediate and breathtaking. From 3 different positions in the forest came answering calls, not barks, but the distinctive vocalizations of bobcats. But these weren't the typical yowls or hisses of wild felines. These were coordinated, controlled, clearly communicative sounds that made every agent reach for their weapons. Shadow emerged first, stepping out of the underbrush 30 yards to the east with the fluid grace of a natural predator. At 8 months old, she was already larger than most adult bobcats, her muscles clearly defined beneath her spotted coat, her golden eyes fixed on the federal agents with an intelligence that was distinctly unsettling. Storm appeared next, positioning himself to the west, while Spirit materialized directly behind the government vehicles, cutting off their retreat route. "Jesus Christ," one of the agents whispered, his weapon trained on Shadow but his hands visibly shaking. "How big are they?" Ravencrow's professional composure cracked as he stared at the cubs he'd last seen as tiny, helpless creatures. "This is impossible. They shouldn't be this developed for another 6 months at minimum." "Maybe you don't know as much about these animals as you think," Sarah said, feeling fierce pride surge through her. The cubs hadn't just grown, they'd been transformed by Thunder's training and her care into something unprecedented. They moved with military precision, but retained the wild intelligence of their species, creating a combination that was clearly beyond Ravencrow's experience or expectations. Mills raised her hand, signaling her team to hold their positions. "Dr. Whitehorse, call off your animals and surrender them peacefully. No one needs to get hurt here." "They're not my animals," Sarah replied. "They're my family, and you're trespassing on our land." "This is federal property now," Mills snapped, her professional calm finally cracking. "We have eminent domain authority under the National Security Act. This entire area is being classified as a restricted zone." The legal maneuvering was elegant and brutal. They were essentially stealing her sanctuary, claiming it for the government to justify their presence and actions. But Sarah had learned something important during her years of isolation. Sometimes the law was just another weapon used by people with power against those without it. That's when Chief Bear Cloud's voice crackled through the emergency radio Sarah wore on her belt. "Sarah, you've got company coming up the back trail. Local news crew from Denver, plus some federal marshals who don't look happy about being here." The cavalry was arriving, but Sarah wasn't sure if they were riding to her rescue or her execution. The media attention that Chief Bear Cloud had orchestrated might provide some protection, but it could just as easily force the federal agents to act more decisively before witnesses could complicate their mission. Thunder seemed to sense the shifting dynamics, his posture becoming more aggressive as he moved to position himself between Sarah and the largest concentration of armed agents. The Cubs responded to his leadership, tightening their perimeter in a way that demonstrated both their tactical training and their absolute loyalty to their unusual pack. "Dr. Ravencrow," Sarah called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with dangerous animals. "You said these cubs were bred for military purposes. What exactly did you create them to do?" Ravencrow's hesitation was answer enough, but Mills cut him off before he could respond. "That information is classified at the highest levels. These animals represent significant federal investment and potential national security assets." Assets. Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. "You created living weapons and called them assets, just like you created Tommy's accident and called it collateral damage." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Several agents exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of what they were participating in. Mills's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "I don't know what you're talking about. Your colleague, Dr. Ravencrow, was kind enough to explain how my son died because he asked inconvenient questions about illegal animal experimentation, how his car accident was arranged to discourage further investigation." Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word, fueled by 3 years of suppressed rage and grief. "How many other families have you destroyed to protect your classified programs?" The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and Sarah could see dust clouds rising from both access roads to her property. The situation was escalating beyond anyone's control, with too many variables and too many weapons for any outcome to be predictable. Thunder's low growl intensified, and the Cubs shifted their positions slightly, closing the tactical net around the federal agents with movements so coordinated they seemed choreographed. But Sarah knew better. This wasn't choreography. This was family protecting family, using every advantage Thunder had taught them and every bond they'd forged through months of shared survival. Mills raised her radio, clearly preparing to call for additional support or authorization to use force. Sarah realized they were standing on the edge of a precipice, with violence and tragedy waiting on all sides. The unthinkable was about to happen, and there was no way to stop it. The first gunshot shattered the mountain silence like breaking glass, fired by a nervous agent who mistook Spirit's repositioning for an attack. The bullet went wide, splintering bark from a pine tree, but the damage was irreversible. Thunder's military training kicked in instantly, transforming him from protective guardian to combat operative in the space of a heartbeat. The German Shepherd launched himself at the shooter with devastating precision, his 100-pound frame striking the agent's center mass and driving him to the ground. The man's weapon flew from his hands as Thunder's jaws clamped down on his forearm not to kill. Sarah realized with horrified clarity, but to disable and disarm according to rules of engagement drilled into him during his military service. Chaos erupted across the clearing as the Cubs responded to Thunder's attack with coordinated fury that spoke to months of training under his guidance. Shadow flanked the eastern group of agents, her movements liquid and lethal as she used terrain and surprise to scatter their formation. Storm charged directly at the vehicles, his powerful hindquarters launching him onto the hood of the nearest SUV with enough force to shatter the windshield. But it was Spirit who demonstrated the true horror of what Ravencrow's program had created. The smallest of the three cubs moved through the federal agents like death itself, using speed and agility that seemed to defy natural law. He didn't kill some instinct or training held him back from that final line, but he systematically disabled weapons, severed radio cords, and created panic among trained professionals who had never faced anything like him. Sarah watched in sick fascination as her makeshift family transformed from beloved pets into living weapons. Their months of peaceful existence in her sanctuary stripped away in seconds to reveal the predators they'd always been underneath. This was what Ravencrow had meant about their enhanced capabilities, what he'd warned would happen as they matured. They weren't just protecting her, they were waging war with skills no wild animal should possess. "Stand down! Stand down!" Mills screamed into her radio. But half her team's communications equipment had been destroyed by Spirit's surgical strikes, and the other half was too busy trying to avoid Thunder's methodical advance to respond coherently. Dr. Ravencrow pressed himself against his vehicle, his professional composure completely shattered as he watched his carefully controlled experiment spiral into violence. "This isn't possible," he kept repeating, his voice rising to a near shriek. "They're not supposed to be this coordinated. The behavioral conditioning should have prevented pack tactics." A second gunshot rang out, this one fired deliberately at Shadow as she cornered two agents behind their SUV. The bullet caught her in the left shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the underbrush with a cry that made Sarah's heart shatter. The sound that emerged from Thunder's throat in response wasn't a bark or a growl. It was the howl of a creature whose family had been wounded, whose protective instincts had been pushed beyond all reason. Sarah ran toward Shadow's position, ignoring the weapons trained on her from multiple directions, ignoring Mills' shouted orders to stop, ignoring everything except the desperate need to reach her injured daughter. Thunder appeared beside her, his muzzle bloody, but his eyes focused with the laser intensity of someone who had chosen his priority and would let nothing stand in his way. They found Shadow behind a fallen log, her golden eyes glazed with pain but still alert, still trying to position herself to rejoin the fight. The wound was bleeding heavily but didn't appear to have hit vital organs, a flesh wound that would heal if she received proper treatment, but potentially fatal if left untended in the wilderness. "Easy, baby girl," Sarah whispered, her veterinary training taking over despite the chaos around them. "I've got you. You're going to be okay." But as she knelt beside Shadow, applying pressure to the wound with strips torn from her own shirt, Sarah heard the sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. Storm was screaming, not the controlled vocalizations he'd been using during the fight, but the raw, agonized cry of an animal in mortal pain. She turned to see him collapsed beside one of the SUVs, his powerful body convulsing as foam flecked his muzzle. One of the agents held a tranquilizer rifle, its dart protruding from Storm's flank like an accusation. But something had gone wrong, the dosage, the chemical composition, his enhanced physiology, and instead of sedating him, the drug was killing him. "No," Sarah screamed, abandoning Shadow to Thunder's protection as she ran toward Storm. "The dosage is wrong. He's too big. His metabolism is different." Storm's convulsions intensified, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. Sarah reached him just as his breathing began to fail. his magnificent heart struggling against chemicals designed for normal animals, not whatever Ravencrow's program had created. She knelt beside him in the blood-soaked dirt, her hands frantically checking for vital signs that were fading with each passing second. Thunder appeared beside her, whimpering as he licked Storm's unresponsive face, trying to wake his adopted son through sheer force of will. Spirit materialized from the chaos, pressing against Storm's other side with desperate intensity, as if his presence alone could anchor his brother to life. The three humans who had become his family surrounded Storm in his final moments, but their love wasn't enough to counteract the poison burning through his enhanced system. Sarah felt Storm's heartbeat falter, then stop entirely beneath her hands. The magnificent predator who had learned to be gentle, who had responded to Thunder's discipline with the eagerness of a beloved son, who had protected her with fierce loyalty despite every instinct that should have made him fear humans, was gone. The silence that followed his death was absolute and terrible. Even the federal agents stopped their tactical movements, recognizing that something irreversible had just occurred, something that would change the nature of everything that followed. Thunder raised his head and howled a sound of grief so pure and devastating that it seemed to echo off the mountains themselves, calling the spirits of the dead and the living alike to witness this moment of unbearable loss. Shadow answered from her position behind the log, her voice weak but determined, while Spirit pressed closer to Storm's still body, refusing to accept that his brother was gone. Sarah knelt in the dirt beside her dead son, her hands still pressed against his silent chest, and felt something fundamental break inside her heart. They had come for her family, these government agents with their classified programs and national security justifications, and they had murdered one of her children in the process. The war had begun in earnest now, and there would be no mercy on either side. The media trucks arrived 20 minutes after Storm's death, their satellite dishes extending like mechanical flowers seeking signal amid the carnage. Sarah knelt beside her fallen cub, her hands still pressed against his cooling body, while Thunder maintained a protective stance that dared anyone to approach. Shadow had crawled from her hiding place despite her wound, pressing herself against Storm's other side in a vigil that spoke to bonds deeper than species. Deputy Director Mills attempted to establish a perimeter around the scene, but Chief Bearcloud had anticipated this moment. The tribal police chief emerged from the tree line with 2 federal marshals whose jurisdiction superseded Mills' authority, their faces grim with the knowledge of what they were walking into. "Stand down your weapons," Marshal Jennifer Hayes commanded, her voice carrying the weight of federal law that even Homeland Security couldn't ignore. "This scene is now under the jurisdiction of the FBI's Civil Rights Division, pending investigation of potential violations of the Posse Comitatus Act." The legal maneuvering was elegant in its brutality. Bearcloud had done his homework, identifying the jurisdictional conflicts that could tie Mills' operation in knots long enough for public scrutiny to complicate their objectives. The presence of media cameras made every action subject to national scrutiny, transforming what should have been a quiet extraction into a public relations nightmare. Dr. Ravencrow stood beside his vehicle, his professional composure completely shattered as he stared at Storm's body. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he kept repeating, his voice hollow with shock. The tranquilizer dosage was calculated for normal physiology. Their enhanced metabolism should have processed it more efficiently, not less. Sarah looked up from Storm's still form, her eyes burning with hatred that seemed to physically manifest in the air between them. "Enhanced metabolism. Is that what you call torture now?" clinical terms to make yourself feel better about what you've done. Dr. Whitehorse, you don't understand the complexity of what we were trying to achieve. I understand that you killed my son. The words came out flat and deadly, cutting through Ravencrow's explanations like a blade through tissue. Just like you killed Tommy. Just like you'll kill anyone who gets in the way of your classified programs. Marshal Hayes stepped forward, her recording device clearly visible as she documented every word. Dr. Ravencrow, are you admitting to involvement in the death of Tommy Whitehorse? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Ravencrow's eyes darted between Mills, the cameras, and the growing crowd of witnesses, calculating the cost of truth against the price of continued lies. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Tommy Whitehorse discovered classified information about Project Wildfire through his mother's veterinary records. His questions attracted attention from security personnel who deemed him a potential intelligence risk. Ravencrow's professional mask was crumbling in real time, revealing the broken man underneath. I argued that he was just a curious child, but the decision came from levels above my authority. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. 3 years of grief, 3 years of suspicion and guilt and rage, and now the confirmation that her 5-year-old son had been murdered by his own government for the crime of asking questions. "Who gave the order?" Marshal Hayes pressed, her recorder capturing every word for posterity and prosecution. Deputy Director Mills was project liaison at the time. She classified Tommy's inquiries as a security breach requiring immediate containment. Ravencrow's voice gained strength as he continued, as if confession was providing relief from years of guilt. The car accident was staged by a federal contractor specializing in such operations. Mills raised her weapon, training it on Ravencrow with the cold precision of someone who had crossed too many lines to turn back now. "You're in violation of your security oath. Doctor, I'm authorized to prevent disclosure of classified information by any means necessary." The threat was clear, but Marshal Hayes stepped between them, her own sidearm drawn but pointed at the ground. "Deputy Director, you're under federal investigation for conspiracy to commit murder and violation of civil rights under color of law. Lower your weapon immediately." Thunder's growl intensified as he sensed the escalating tension, his military training recognizing the tactical situation developing around his grieving family. Spirit had positioned himself between the armed federal agents and Sarah. His young body coiled for action despite his obvious devastation at Storm's death. That's when Emma Stormcloud's voice cut through the chaos, broadcast live on 3 different news networks as she provided real-time commentary from behind the media cordon. Sarah's 16-year-old niece had arrived with the news crews, her smartphone streaming video that was already being shared across social media platforms. "This is what government accountability looks like," Emma said into her phone's camera, her voice steady despite her tears. "They killed a 5-year-old boy to protect their secrets. They tortured animals in the name of national security. And now they're threatening to kill anyone who tells the truth about what they've done." The power of social media was evident in the immediate response. Sarah could see agents in the background checking their phones, their faces growing pale as they read messages and watched view counts climb into the hundreds of thousands. This wasn't a classified operation anymore. It was a public scandal that would end careers and potentially bring down entire departments. Mills seemed to recognize the shifting dynamics, her weapon wavering as she calculated the cost of continued action against the price of strategic retreat. But Deputy Director Catherine Mills hadn't risen through the ranks of Homeland Security by accepting defeat gracefully. "Dr. Ravencrow is suffering from acute stress reaction," she announced to the assembled crowd, her voice regaining its professional authority. "His statements are the product of psychological breakdown and cannot be considered reliable testimony." "I have documentation," Ravencrow said suddenly, his voice gaining strength as he made his final choice between complicity and conscience. "Project files, correspondence, video evidence of the procedures performed on the cub's mother. Everything is stored in secure servers with dead man switches that will release the information if anything happens to me." The revelation hit Mills like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed narrative was collapsing in real time, broadcast live to an audience that was growing by the minute. The classified program she'd spent years protecting was about to become public knowledge, along with her role in Tommy's murder and the illegal animal experimentation. Sarah rose from Storm's body, her grief transforming into something harder and more dangerous. Shadow struggled to her feet beside her, blood still seeping from her shoulder wound, but her golden eyes blazing with determination. Thunder moved to flank them, his protective stance making clear that this family had chosen to stand together against whatever came next. "You took my son," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the clearing with biblical authority. "You tortured innocent animals. You murdered Storm to protect your secrets. But you made one crucial mistake." Mills raised her weapon again, but Marshal Hayes was faster, her sidearm now trained on the Homeland Security Deputy Director. "What mistake was that, Dr. Whitehorse?" Sarah looked directly into the news cameras, speaking to an audience far beyond the mountain clearing where her world had been shattered and rebuilt and shattered again. "You assumed that broken people stay broken, that grief makes you weak instead of dangerous, that love is a vulnerability instead of a weapon." Thunder's howl rose again, joined by Shadow's weaker but determined voice and Spirit's high, clear call. The sound echoed off the mountains like a battle cry, carrying the pain and fury and unbreakable bonds of a family that had been forged in tragedy and tempered by loss. The government had created weapons in their classified laboratories, but they had failed to understand the most powerful weapon of all, the love between creatures who choose to become family despite every barrier society places between them. The real battle was just beginning. The congressional hearing, convened 3 months after Storm's death, held in the grand chamber where American democracy had wrestled with its conscience for over 2 centuries. Sarah sat at the witness table, her hands folded carefully over the manila folder containing photographs of Storm's final moments, while Thunder lay at her feet in the service dog vest that gave him legal access to the proceedings. The German shepherd's presence had become essential to Sarah's ability to function since that terrible day in the mountains, his steady breathing and warm weight anchoring her when grief threatened to pull her under. Shadow rested in a specially constructed enclosure, visible through the chamber's windows, her shoulder wound healed, but her spirit forever marked by the loss of her brother. The sight of her golden eyes watching through the glass had drawn gasps from the assembled crowd when the session began. But now the young Bobcat served as living testimony to the program's consequences, beautiful, intelligent, and irreparably damaged by human ambition. Committee Chairman Robert Patterson called the hearing to order with the gravity befitting an investigation into governmental murder and conspiracy. The elderly senator from Colorado had seen enough Washington scandals to recognize when the foundations of public trust were at stake. And the Whitehorse case had already claimed 3 cabinet-level resignations and triggered a Department of Justice investigation that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Dr. Whitehorse, Chairman Patterson began, his voice gentle despite the formal setting, please tell this committee in your own words what happened to your son Tommy 3 years ago. Sarah's voice was steady as she recounted the official story, a 5-year-old boy who died in a single-car accident on a clear day. His vehicle inexplicably leaving the road and striking a tree with enough force to kill him instantly. She described the questions that had haunted her for years. Why Tommy's seatbelt had been cut rather than torn. Why there were no skid marks despite clear road conditions. Why the investigating officer had been transferred to another state within a week of filing his report. And what have you learned about the true circumstances of your son's death? Patterson prompted. Tommy died because he discovered veterinary records in my files that referenced Project Wildfire, Sarah replied, her words carrying across the packed chamber with crystalline clarity. He was curious about why wild animals were being brought to military facilities, why their medical treatments included procedures that had nothing to do with standard veterinary care. He asked innocent questions that threatened to expose a classified program, so they murdered him to protect their secrets. The committee room erupted in shocked murmurs, but Patterson's gavel quickly restored order. The documentation supporting Sarah's testimony had already been entered into evidence. Dr. Ravencrow's confession, classified emails discussing Tommy as a security risk, and forensic analysis of the car accident that revealed clear signs of sabotage. Deputy Director Mills had been arrested 6 weeks earlier, her carefully constructed career collapsing under the weight of evidence that Ravencrow's dead man switches had released to news organizations worldwide. The videos from Project Wildfire's laboratories had sparked international outrage, showing procedures performed on wild animals that violated every principle of ethical research and basic humanity. Dr. Ravencrow himself sat at the adjacent witness table, his appearance transformed by months of federal custody and the psychological weight of his confessions. The man who had once presented himself as a concerned wildlife specialist now looked like what he truly was, a war criminal, whose participation in illegal experiments had cost lives both animal and human. Dr. Ravencrow, Patterson addressed the broken veterinarian. Please describe for this committee the true purpose of Project Wildfire. Ravencrow's voice was barely audible as he detailed the program's objectives, creating enhanced predators for military applications, developing behavioral conditioning techniques that could be applied to human subjects, and establishing off-the-books research facilities on tribal lands where federal oversight was complicated by jurisdictional disputes. The cub's mother was our most successful subject, he admitted, his words falling like stones into the chamber's silence. Her intelligence had been enhanced through selective breeding and chemical interventions. Her offspring inherited those traits, which is why they developed so rapidly under Dr. Whitehorse's care. Sarah felt Thunder's weight shift against her leg. The German Shepherd's own enhanced capabilities a reminder that Project Wildfire's scope had extended far beyond wild animals. Military working dogs like Thunder had been early test subjects, their loyalty and intelligence augmented through procedures that violated every principle of veterinary ethics. Committee member Senator Maria Santos leaned forward, her voice sharp with prosecutorial precision. Dr. Ravencrow, how many children were identified as security risks by Project Wildfire? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ravencrow's hands shook as he consulted his notes, his voice cracking as he provided the horrific answer. 17 children across 6 states were classified as requiring permanent containment due to their knowledge of classified activities. Tommy Whitehorse was the youngest. The chamber exploded in outrage, but Sarah felt only a cold, hollow satisfaction. The truth was finally being spoken in the halls of power, broadcast to a nation that was learning the price of unchecked government authority and classified programs that operated beyond any moral oversight. Emma Stormcloud, now 18 and attending Georgetown University on a journalism scholarship funded by public donations, provided testimony about the media campaign that had forced the government's hand. Her live stream from that terrible day in the mountains had been viewed over 50 million times, becoming a rallying cry for government accountability and animal rights that had sparked protests in every major American city. Chief Bear Cloud testified about the jurisdictional violations that had allowed Project Wildfire to operate on tribal lands. His weathered face showing the strain of a man who had spent months fighting federal attorneys to protect his people's sovereignty. The tribal lands where Sarah's sanctuary stood had been officially returned to tribal control, with federal compensation for the illegal occupation and use. But it was the testimony of Marshal Jennifer Hayes that delivered the killing blow to any remaining government credibility. The federal law enforcement officer detailed the cover-up that had followed Storm's death, the attempts to silence witnesses, and the destruction of evidence that had continued even after congressional oversight had begun. The level of corruption we uncovered goes beyond individual bad actors, Hayes testified, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. This was systematic abuse of federal authority, with multiple agencies coordinating to protect classified programs that violated both domestic and international law. As the hearing approached its conclusion, Chairman Patterson turned to Sarah for her final statement. She rose slowly, thunder at her side and shadow visible through the windows behind her, the remnants of her impossible family bearing witness to the cost of government secrecy. "My son died because he was curious," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years of grief and struggle. "Storm died because they couldn't control what they had created. 17 other children died because they asked inconvenient questions. But their deaths have meaning now, because the truth has finally been told." She looked directly into the cameras that were broadcasting her words around the world, speaking to parents and children and anyone who had ever wondered what their government did in the shadows. "Love is stronger than fear, stronger than secrecy, stronger than the institutions that try to silence us. Thunder chose to be a father when the government tried to make him a weapon. Shadow and Spirit chose to protect rather than destroy. And I chose to fight rather than surrender. Because that's what families do. We protect each other, no matter the cost." The standing ovation that followed lasted 7 minutes, but Sarah barely heard it. She was thinking about Tommy, about Storm, about all the lives that had been lost to protect secrets that should never have existed. Justice was finally coming, but it could never bring back the dead or heal the wounds that power had inflicted on the innocent. Still, as she walked from the chamber with Thunder beside her and Shadow watching from her sanctuary, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, hope that the future might be different, that love might finally triumph over the machinery of government power that had taken so much from so many. The unthinkable had happened. The truth had been told, and democracy had listened. 5 years have passed since that terrible morning in the mountains, and Sarah Whitehorse stands on her porch, watching the sunrise paint the Colorado peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Thunder, now 12, and moving with the careful dignity of an aging warrior, lies beside her chair, while Shadow and Spirit patrol the expanded sanctuary that has become a beacon of hope for rescued animals across the nation. The congressional hearings led to sweeping reforms in government oversight, the dissolution of illegal research programs, and compensation for the families whose children paid the ultimate price for asking questions their government didn't want answered. Tommy's Memorial Clinic treats hundreds of animals each year, staffed by veterinarians who work without the fear of government retaliation that once drove Sarah into exile. Emma, now a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, visits monthly with new stories of government accountability and transparency victories that trace their origins back to that live stream from a mountain clearing where love proved stronger than official power. But perhaps the most profound change is visible in Sarah herself, no longer the broken woman who fled to the mountains in grief, but a grandmother figure to countless rescued animals who have learned that families aren't always born, but sometimes chosen, that healing is possible even after devastating loss, and that the bonds we forge in darkness can become the light that guides us home. Thunder's gentle rumble and the cub's contented presence remind her daily that love transcends every boundary, even death itself, creating legacies that endure long after the pain has transformed into purpose. In the golden light of another mountain dawn, 3 species that nature never intended to unite continue their unlikely family bond, living proof that hope can bloom in the most broken places, and that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with a single act of choosing love over fear.